It was late 1943, and the young German soldier, Georg Gartner, stood on the deck of a transport ship, his gaze fixed on the approaching American coastline. For years, Gartner had been an eager student of the Nazi Party, his mind meticulously shaped by the virulent propaganda that painted the United States as a chaotic, racially degenerate nation rife with internal conflict and moral decay. He had been taught to expect squalor, oppression, and unwavering hostility from his captors. As the vessel drew closer to the busy port, what he witnessed began to sow the first disquieting seeds of doubt. The docks were not manned by the ragged, downtrodden masses he'd been promised, but by a vibrant, diverse workforce. White and black Americans toiled side by side, conversing, laughing, and yes, even giving orders to one another, in a way that utterly defied the rigid racial hierarchies central to his Nazi worldview. This was not the broken, racially impure society Goebbels had so vehemently decried. This was something else entirely. This was Georg Gartner's unexpected introduction to the very nation he had been raised to despise, an introduction that would, over the coming months, systematically dismantle every lie he had ever believed. As Georg Gartner and his fellow prisoners disembarked onto the bustling docks of Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia, the scene that unfolded before them was a jarring assault on every deeply ingrained prejudice and propaganda-fueled belief they held. This wasn't the collapsing, racially degenerate America that Joseph Goebbels' ministry had relentlessly depicted. Instead, it was a vibrant, dynamic tableau of efficiency and diversity. Standing shoulder to shoulder, overseeing the disembarkation, were American soldiers and sailors. But what truly stunned Gartner and his comrades was the composition of the civilian workforce. Black and white men and women working side by side, seemingly without the racial strife and segregation their propaganda had promised. There were no riots, no overt signs of the inferior races undermining the nation, as they had been led to believe. This was a cohesive, functioning society, where people of different backgrounds contributed to a common, vital war effort. It was an immediate, visceral refutation of the core tenets of Nazi racial superiority. Beyond the immediate confines of the docks, the glimpses of American life were equally bewildering. Civilian cars, a luxury almost unimaginable in wartime Germany, moved freely. The streets appeared well-maintained, the buildings sturdy and unscarred by the ravages of war that were all too familiar in Europe. Even the food they were given, wholesome, abundant, and served without the usual rationing and scarcity they had experienced, spoke volumes. This was not a nation on the brink of collapse. This was a nation brimming with resources and an almost unsettling sense of normalcy, despite being at war. For years, Nazi radio broadcasts and newspapers had painted a picture of America as a weak, materialistic, and fundamentally divided nation, teetering on the edge of internal collapse, its people soft and degenerate. Gartner, like so many young Germans, had internalized this narrative. He had believed it. Yet, here, staring directly into the face of American reality, that elaborate tapestry of lies began to unravel, thread by painful thread. The sheer scale of American industry, the evident prosperity, and perhaps most profoundly, the casual coexistence of different races presented a profound cognitive dissonance. The enemy was not weak, the enemy was formidable, organized, and, most surprisingly, appeared to be thriving.
This initial exposure wasn't merely surprising, it was an ideological earthquake, shaking the very foundations of Georg Gartner's worldview. The America he was now experiencing was not the caricature of Nazi propaganda, but a powerful, complex, and bewildering reality that demanded a complete reevaluation of everything he thought he knew. The journey had only just begun, but the first cracks in the edifice of his Nazi beliefs had already appeared. For Georg Gartner and his fellow prisoners, the initial shock of America's vibrant, diverse society at Norfolk was merely the overture to a far more profound ideological challenge that awaited them behind the wire. Their ultimate destination, for many, was Camp Hearn, a sprawling prisoner of war facility nestled in the flatlands near Hearn, Texas. Here, the barbed wire and watchtowers were undeniable symbols of their captivity. Yet what lay within those confines was a reality so incongruous with years of Nazi propaganda that it bordered on the absurd. The barracks, for instance, were not the squalid, disease-ridden hovels Goebbels' machinery had promised. Instead, they were sturdy, well-maintained wooden structures, surprisingly comfortable, offering each man a bunk, often with a mattress and blankets. This was a significant upgrade for many who had endured the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, a comfort that immediately chipped away at the image of a cruel, decadent enemy. Beyond physical comfort, the Americans introduced a concept that utterly confounded the rigid Nazi mind: self-governance. Prisoners were permitted to elect their own Vertrauensmann, or trust leader, a representative who would liaise directly with the American command. These elected leaders had genuine agency, overseeing internal camp discipline, organizing recreational activities, and advocating for their fellow prisoners. For Georg Gartner, raised in a system where every directive flowed from above, witnessing this nascent form of democracy, where common soldiers had a voice and a choice, was a disorienting, almost revolutionary experience. It suggested a level of trust and respect from their captors that was entirely unanticipated. And then there was the canteen. This wasn't merely a point for ration distribution. It was a functioning store. With the small wages earned from permitted labor, prisoners could purchase a range of items: cigarettes, chocolate, toiletries, even magazines and stationery. The very act of choosing, of exercising individual consumer power within a military prison, was a profound psychological gesture. It fostered a sense of personal agency and normalcy that ran directly counter to the narrative of a brutalized enemy. These elements, the comfortable living, the surprising dignity of self-governance, the simple freedom of a canteen purchase, began to systematically erode the carefully constructed enemy narrative that had fueled Gartner's convictions. The reality behind American barbed wire wasn't one of degradation and despair, but of a strange, unsettling normalcy. A community where former enemies were treated with a respect that forced them to question everything they thought they knew about their adversaries and about themselves. When the camp gates no longer served as an absolute boundary, Georg Gartner and thousands of other prisoners were brought into labor programs, and another aspect of the American experience began to reveal itself. This was not the slave labor that Nazi propaganda had described as the fate of prisoners. Instead, it was a direct connection to the roaring American war machine, an unexpected encounter with the very society they had been taught to hate. Gartner found himself working alongside Americans from every walk of life: farmers, factory workers, even soldiers on leave or performing logistical duties. The first sights left him stunned. Men and women, white people and black people, working together, shoulder to shoulder. For the young German soldiers, who had grown up in a system of strict racial segregation and limited roles for women, this was a devastating blow to their core beliefs. They had been taught that America was weak because of its racial mixing, and that women belonged only in the home. But here, they saw strong, dynamic American women operating machinery, supervising work, and speaking openly and confidently. The efficiency of American industry was another shock. Whether it was harvesting cotton on vast fields in Texas, logging timber, or participating in construction projects, Gartner witnessed an abundance and pace of production he had never imagined. Machinery seemed to be everywhere, working quickly and tirelessly. The American workers, though diligent, appeared to live comfortably, with hearty meals and neat clothing. This completely contradicted the image of a decaying, starving nation that Hitler's propaganda machine had painted. In occasional interactions, the German soldiers were permitted to converse with their American counterparts, a limited but meaningful exchange. Gartner listened as Americans casually discussed upcoming elections, openly criticized the government, and debated social issues without fear. This was an alien concept to him, having lived his entire life under a regime where even a whispered dissent could lead to catastrophic consequences. He observed young Americans driving cars freely, dating openly, and women having a say in decisions he thought were reserved for men. It was not just what they saw, but what they did not see. No overt oppression, no constant surveillance, no shortages. Instead, there was a sense of normalcy,
a daily rhythm that, even in wartime, maintained an astonishing level of freedom and prosperity. These experiences, initially vague observations, gradually became undeniable evidence, gnawing away at the ideological foundation Gartner had built throughout his life. The world he had been taught to believe in crumbled piece by piece, not by the force of bullets, but by the power of an entirely different culture. Even within the structured confines of the camps, and during the supervised labor details that saw them interact with the wider American populace, a far more insidious form of re-education was taking root. It wasn't the formal lectures or the carefully curated newsreels. It was the unfiltered, undeniable reality of American society that began to seep into the minds of men like Georg Gartner. The daily grind presented a stark, living contrast to everything he had been taught to believe about the decadent, chaotic West.
For a mind steeped in the absolute obedience demanded by the Third Reich, where dissent was treason and leadership infallible, the casual, often scathing criticism leveled against President Roosevelt, the government, or even the war effort itself was nothing short of an ideological earthquake. Gartner observed American citizens openly debating, disagreeing, and even ridiculing their leaders in ways that would have led to immediate imprisonment or worse in Germany. This wasn't staged propaganda, it was the everyday fabric of a free society, a spectacle that forced a re-evaluation of the truth he had held so sacred. Then there were the youth. Nazi Germany's children were militarized from an early age, indoctrinated into the Hitler Youth, their lives meticulously planned and regimented. Here, Gartner witnessed young Americans, seemingly unburdened by such rigid discipline, roaming with an autonomy that was both baffling and perhaps alluring. They exhibited a sense of independence, often unsupervised, engaging in activities that seemed to lack the strict ideological purpose so central to German youth culture. This freedom, interpreted through a Nazi lens, should have signified weakness and decay, yet it manifested as a vibrant, resilient society. And perhaps most jarring for a man raised on the rigid gender roles of the Third Reich were the American women. Not just as homemakers or factory workers, but often in positions of visible authority. Gartner saw women managing farms, supervising work details, and even serving as guards, roles that fundamentally contradicted the Nazi ideal of women as solely mothers and homemakers confined to the domestic sphere. These were not the inferior women described by Goebbels' propaganda. They were competent, independent, and undeniably integral to the functioning of American society. Each observation, each unexpected encounter with a reality so profoundly different from the one he had been conditioned to expect, chipped away at the carefully constructed edifice of Nazi ideology within Georg Gartner's mind, sowing the first, almost imperceptible seeds of doubt. The seeds of doubt, once sown, required careful cultivation. The American strategy, far from being merely about containment, encompassed a profound, audacious vision: the re-education of an entire generation of German soldiers. The goal was nothing less than to dismantle the ideological fortress within their minds and, perhaps, forge the bedrock for a future democratic Germany. For men like Georg Gartner, who had lived and breathed the doctrines of Nazism for years, this was not merely an academic exercise, it was a profound challenge to his very identity. The camps became classrooms, laboratories of democracy, where books replaced bullets and ideas became the new battlefield. Central to this initiative were the camp libraries, far from the sparse, censored collections Gartner was accustomed to. Here, shelves overflowed with volumes on world history, philosophy, American literature, and, crucially, texts that elucidated democratic principles and the mechanisms of free societies. He could pick up a copy of the U.S. Constitution, a biography of Abraham Lincoln, or even works of German authors previously banned by the Reich. Alongside the libraries, distance learning courses offered a structured pathway to new knowledge. POWs could enroll in English language classes, civics lessons, and vocational training, all delivered by American universities and educational institutions. This wasn't just about acquiring practical skills, it was about exposing them to the American educational system itself, a system built on open inquiry and diverse perspectives. Perhaps even more impactful were the camp newspapers.
These publications, often edited by the POWs themselves under American supervision, provided uncensored news from the outside world, critical analyses of global events, and robust discussions about democratic governance. They offered a stark contrast to the monolithic propaganda of the Nazi regime, presenting multiple viewpoints and encouraging critical thinking rather than blind obedience.
Georg Gartner, initially wary, found himself drawn into this intellectual current. He began frequenting the library, at first out of sheer boredom, then out of a burgeoning, almost defiant curiosity. He read articles in the camp newspaper that openly questioned the very narratives he had been taught to believe as absolute truth. He studied the rudimentary English phrases, not just to communicate, but to access even more unfiltered information. His rigid worldview, so carefully constructed by years of indoctrination, began to crack under the weight of empirical evidence and rational discourse. He wrestled with the uncomfortable truths presented, comparing them against his lived experience of humane treatment in American captivity. The dissonance was immense, a constant internal argument between the world he had left behind and the astonishing reality unfolding before him. He started to connect the dots. The respect for individual dignity he witnessed, the freedom of expression he read about, and the principles of self-governance he learned in his civics courses. These were not abstract concepts, but the very foundations of the society that treated its enemies with such unexpected generosity. This deliberate, multifaceted re-education was not a quick fix, but a slow, arduous intellectual journey, and for Gartner, it was a pivotal chapter in his profound transformation. Georg Gartner, like countless others among his captured comrades, had arrived on American soil with a mind meticulously sculpted by years of unwavering Nazi indoctrination. Every facet of his worldview, from the rigid tenets of racial purity to the unwavering belief in German economic superiority, had been hammered into him with the relentless force of state-sponsored propaganda. America, he had been taught, was a decadent, racially impure nation on the precipice of collapse, its people weak, its economy faltering, its very soul corrupted by capitalist greed and Jewish influence. Yet, from the moment he first stepped off that transport ship in Norfolk, those carefully constructed mantle fortresses began an agonizing, inevitable process of deconstruction. The sheer, undeniable reality of his surroundings created an intense and profound cognitive dissonance. How could this nation, so clearly vibrant and efficient, be on the brink of ruin? He witnessed firsthand the American military's integrated units, where African American soldiers, so demonized and dehumanized in Nazi propaganda, held positions of authority and respect within their own ranks. This was a direct, undeniable visual refutation of everything he had been taught about racial hierarchy. It was a truth so jarring, so utterly alien to his indoctrination, that it forced a chasm open in his mind, challenging the very bedrock of his beliefs. Then there was the bewildering abundance. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a struggling capitalist wasteland rife with poverty and breadlines. Yet Gartner saw fields overflowing with produce, factories churning out goods at an unimaginable pace, and a casual disregard for material wealth that bordered on wasteful. He vividly recalled an incident where perfectly good food, simply because it was not perfect for market, was discarded, a concept unfathomable in a Germany constantly battling scarcity even before the war intensified. This wasn't the image of a collapsing nation. It was the image of an industrial colossus, effortlessly producing far more than it consumed. Perhaps most unsettling, yet ultimately most liberating, was the unfiltered access to American media and political discourse. Gartner and his fellow prisoners were given newspapers, listened to radios, and were even exposed to public debates. He would read scathing criticisms of President Roosevelt, heard open dissent against government policies, and watched as citizens freely voice their opinions, often in direct opposition to the state. This was an absolute inversion of the totalitarian control he knew, where a single critical word could mean imprisonment or worse. It was a dangerous, exhilarating freedom that slowly, irrevocably began to dismantle the absolute authority he had once believed in. This constant bombardment of contradictory realities fueled a relentless internal struggle within Gartner. His mind, trained to categorize and condemn, found itself grappling with irrefutable evidence that defied every tenet of his Nazi faith. The process was not instant. It was a slow, painful unraveling,
a constant internal debate between the rigid doctrines of his past and the undeniable, vibrant truth unfolding before his eyes. Each day, another piece of the carefully constructed Nazi lie chipped away, replaced by the unsettling yet compelling reality of American democracy and ingenuity. He began to question not just the specific claims of the propaganda, but the very foundation of the ideology that had shaped his entire adult life. The world, he realized, was far more complex, far more humane, and far more powerful than the narrow, hateful vision he had once embraced. This intellectual awakening, however, was about to be profoundly underscored by an emotional revelation, an experience that would challenge the very core of his indoctrination, the American Christmas of 1943. Imagine the scene. Thousands of German prisoners, Georg Gartner among them, huddled in camps far from their shattered homeland, the festive season approaching. What could they expect but the bleak, unfeeling efficiency of their captors? Perhaps even a thinly veiled hostility. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as decadent, materialistic, and devoid of true spirit. Yet, the reality that unfolded before them was a spectacle of extraordinary, almost unbelievable generosity. Across America, from the smallest towns adjacent to POW camps to major cities, communities mobilized. Churches, civic organizations, and ordinary families, driven by a profound sense of Christian charity and a uniquely American spirit of goodwill, began preparing for their enemies' Christmas. At camps like Hearn, where Gartner likely spent his holidays, the transformation was astonishing. Barracks were decorated, small Christmas trees appeared, and special holiday meals, far exceeding standard rations, were prepared. Gifts, often handmade or purchased with donated funds, were distributed. Cigarettes, candy, books, sometimes even warm clothing. Local choirs visited, singing carols in German. For many prisoners, it was the first time in years they had experienced such a semblance of peace and celebration. For Georg Gartner, this was not merely a pleasant surprise. It was a psychological earthquake. He had been taught that Americans were a dehumanized foe, yet here they were, showering kindness upon their adversaries. This wasn't a strategic maneuver, it was an act of genuine human compassion. The sheer scale of the effort, the sincerity in the eyes of the volunteers, the warmth in their voices, it shredded the remaining vestiges of his carefully constructed ideological worldview. How could people capable of such profound generosity be the monsters he had been warned about? The contrast between Nazi ideology's depiction of the enemy and the lived reality of American humanity was so stark, so undeniable, that it fostered a deep sense of shared humanity within him. It was a tangible, emotional proof that the world was not simply black and white, divided into us and them, but a complex tapestry woven with threads of kindness that transcended national enmity. This act of grace, extended unconditionally, solidified his burgeoning transformation, demonstrating the quiet yet immense power of empathy to dismantle even the most entrenched hatreds. Georg Gartner, once a staunch believer in the Führer's doctrines, underwent a metamorphosis so profound it challenged every tenet he had held sacred. The indoctrinated Nazi soldier who arrived on American shores filled with hate and ideological rigidity gradually shed his hardened shell, replaced by a deep-seated appreciation for the democratic principles he had been taught to despise. This wasn't merely a shift in allegiance, it was a complete reordering of his worldview, a testament to the power of lived experience over ingrained propaganda. He would later recount in his memoirs, with a voice devoid of bitterness, that the sheer normalcy and decency of American life had been the most potent weapon against his Nazi convictions. It wasn't the explicit anti-Nazi rhetoric that swayed him, but the everyday realities. The integrated workforces, the open political discourse, the respectful treatment, and the abundance that defied Goebbels' starving nation. Gartner, initially a fervent debater, arguing the virtues of National Socialism with anyone who would listen, found his arguments crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence.
He witnessed American soldiers, black and white, side by side, sharing duties and even friendships, a stark refutation of the racial purity he had been taught was paramount. He saw women in positions of authority, expressing their opinions freely, something unimaginable in the strictly patriarchal society he'd left behind. His transformation was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, deliberate shedding of layers. He began to actively seek out alternative perspectives, devouring books from the camp library, engaging in animated discussions during the re-education seminars, and poring over American newspapers that openly criticized their own government. Gartner became an advocate, a quiet but firm voice against the diehards who clung to their fascist dreams. He would patiently explain to his fellow prisoners, often citing his own observations, that the America they were experiencing was not the decadent, weak enemy portrayed by Nazi propaganda, but a vibrant, resilient democracy. He used his personal journey, his own initial skepticism and subsequent enlightenment, as a powerful tool to dismantle the lingering ideological barriers in others. He was a living testament to the fact that even the most deeply ingrained hatred could be overcome by empathy, reason, and the simple, undeniable truth of freedom. Georg Gartner's remarkable journey, from a fervent Nazi soldier to a pillar of American democracy, was not an isolated incident. It was, in fact, a testament to one of history's most ambitious and, ultimately, most successful experiments in ideological transformation. His story, alongside countless others like Hermann Butcher and Reinhold Pell, forms the bedrock of a significant academic consensus that the American prisoner of war program, particularly its re-education through exposure, achieved a profound and lasting impact. Historians widely acknowledge that the deliberate strategy of allowing German POWs to witness and experience American life firsthand, the integration of races in the workplace, the open political discourse, the everyday abundance, and the simple dignity of humane treatment, proved far more effective than any direct propaganda. This wasn't about forced indoctrination. It was about presenting an undeniable reality that directly contradicted years of carefully constructed Nazi lies. The cognitive dissonance experienced by men like Gartner, confronted daily with a vibrant, inclusive, and generous society, gradually eroded their ingrained prejudices and radical beliefs. The long-term implications of this strategy were monumental. Upon their repatriation, these former prisoners, many now ardent believers in democratic ideals, returned to a Germany devastated and ready for change. They became crucial agents in the rebuilding of West Germany, bringing with them not just memories of American prosperity, but a first-hand understanding of how a democratic society functioned. They held positions of influence, from local government to civic leadership, forming the very backbone of the new democratic federal republic. Gartner himself, choosing to remain in the nation that had shown him such transformative grace, lived a life that quietly echoed this success, proving that the ideals of freedom and humanity were not mere rhetoric, but tangible, life-altering forces.
The enduring message of Georg Gartner's story and the broader American POW experience is a powerful one. It illustrates that even the deepest ideological divides, fueled by hatred and misinformation, can be overcome not by force, but by the unwavering demonstration of democratic values, humane treatment, and the sheer compelling reality of freedom. It is a testament to the idea that empathy, when coupled with conviction, possesses the unparalleled power to transform adversaries into allies and to lay the foundations for a more peaceful and just world. When the war finally ended, Georg Gartner was no longer the young man full of hatred who had first set foot on American soil. The re-education and exposure to American democracy had etched into him a completely new set of values. Now it was time for him to return to a devastated Germany, a nation ruined not only materially, but spiritually, torn apart by the remnants of a deadly ideology and the collapse of a world they had once known. Returning home was no triumph. It was a painful return to rubble, to cities reduced to piles of bricks, and a people struggling to survive. But Gartner did not carry the despair or fear that many of his countrymen did. Instead, he carried a vision, one shaped by his experiences in the American prisoner of war camps. He had witnessed the strength of a society where the individual was respected, where ideas were debated freely, and where government was accountable to the people. With a profound sense of responsibility, Gartner deliberately chose to apply the democratic lessons he had learned. He was not merely a compliant citizen, he was a builder. He actively participated in local reconstruction efforts, from clearing debris to organizing community meetings. He became a staunch advocate for the new values, transparency, accountability, and civic participation that he had seen thrive in America. Gartner's journey was a living testament to the success of the American prisoner of war program. He did not hesitate to use his story as an example, sharing what he had learned and how those experiences had transformed his perspective. In an environment where many Germans grappled with guilt, denial, or skepticism, Gartner offered a clear path forward, demonstrating that it was possible to set aside the past and build a new future based on democratic principles. He held leadership positions in his local community, not as a high-ranking political official, but as a trusted citizen who had proven his loyalty to a new democratic Germany. He became a model citizen, a symbol that even the most devoted members of the old regime could be redeemed and contribute positively to a free society.
Gartner's story was not just about personal transformation. It was about reshaping a nation, one citizen at a time, proving the power of real-world exposure and kindness against a totalitarian ideology.